The first thing my wife said when she saw the old woman in my arms was not, "Who is she?" It was, "Io, do not bring her into this house while the commissioner is still here." She said it softly, but there are some voices that do not need volume to cut straight through a room. The orchestra in the garden was still playing.
Why did you leave me this
Crystal
key?
glasses were still clinking. The governor's wife was still standing near the fountain, laughing at something she had not actually found funny. And there I was, standing in the middle of my own entrance hall in wet shoes, holding a half-conscious old woman whose head rested against my shoulder like she had run out of reasons to hold it up itself. My son Toby was at the doorway behind me, soaked from the rain, because he had ignored 3 different people telling him to stay inside. My wife Amara stood at the foot of the staircase in a fitted gold dress, one hand still holding a champagne flute, the other gripping the railing so tightly that the tendons in her wrist showed. The old woman in my arms stirred. Then, with a trembling hand, she lifted something between her fingers. A tiny brass key, dark with age, tied with faded red thread. The moment Commissioner Belogan saw it, the color left his face. Not all at once, just enough for a man who had spent 20 years learning to hide panic in public. Where did she get that? He was staring at the key the way men stare at proof they hoped had been buried with the last witness. And for the first time that night, my wife looked less angry than afraid. If you want to understand why a homeless old woman carrying a key no bigger than a thumb could frighten the richest people in my house, I have to take you back to the morning I found her beneath the old Carter Bridge loading ramp. My name is Ayodele Akinwale. Most people call me Ayo. I am 48 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I believed my mother had died when I was 10. I run Akinwale Coastal Holdings, a transportation and redevelopment company in Lagos that began with 2 rusting buses and 1 borrowed warehouse, and now touches nearly every part of the waterfront between Marina and Apapa. People who know me now think I was born with certainty. They think wealth makes a man decisive. They think suits, boardrooms, and newspaper photos mean a man has always known exactly who he is. But certainty is often just grief that had enough years to harden. That morning, the rain had started before dawn and never truly stopped. Lagos has a way of becoming 2 cities when it rains like that. One city keeps driving, arguing, selling, building, pretending everything is normal. The other fills quietly with the things people did not secure properly. Plastic chairs, sandals, broken crates, old shame. I had gone personally to inspect a strip of waterfront land our company was about to acquire, near the old loading ramp. A place once used by ferries before the route changed and the terminal was left to mildew and memory. My operations manager had warned me that people had begun sleeping under the concrete overhang there. He said it the way men in business often say such things, with concern for liability first and humanity second. I told him we would relocate them properly before construction began. He asked whether I wanted security to clear the place immediately. I said no. I did not know why I said no then. I know now. There was a small crowd gathered beneath the ramp when I arrived. Not the large kind that forms for spectacle, but the quiet kind that forms when everybody has already guessed something bad has happened and nobody wants to be the first to say it aloud. An old woman was slumped against a support pillar, her wrapper soaked through, one shoe missing. A thin market bag beside her, and a cough tearing through her chest like something old and rusted. Someone had covered her with a feed sack. Somebody else had put a sachet of water near her hand. That is poverty in this country, more often than people like to admit. Not the total absence of kindness, but the exhausting smallness of it. Enough to keep a person alive for another hour, rarely enough to change the road ahead. I crouched beside her. Her skin was fever hot. Her lips were dry. There was mud on the hem of her wrapper, and the faint smell of smoke caught in the cloth. Old smoke, the kind that settles into fabric and becomes part of it. I asked if she could hear me. Her eyelids fluttered. Then she looked directly at me and whispered one name. River Boy. Nobody had called me that in 38 years. Not my aunt, not my teachers, not my friends from university, not even my late father's oldest friends, who used to drink palm wine with him on Sundays and remember everything else. River Boy was what my mother called me, because as a child, I never stayed away from water. Drainage ditch, puddle, lagoon edge, it did not matter. If it moved, I wanted to be near it. My father used to laugh and say I would either drown one day or build my life on boats. He was wrong about the first part, very right about the second. I froze there under the bridge, with rainwater dripping from the edge above us and running down the back of my collar. What did you call me? Her fingers fumbled at her chest. Then beneath the edge of her blouse, she pulled out that small brass key tied with red thread. Your father said if I found you, show him the river key. I did not cry. I know stories like this often tell you the man fell apart immediately. That was not me. I have spent too many years teaching my face to stay still while my mind races ahead. So my face stayed still. Inside, everything I believed about the first 10 years of my life cracked open so fast I could not even hear the break. My father, Kehinde Akinwale, died when I was 9. I remember his laugh more clearly than his face some days, which is one of the quietest cruelties time performs on us. After he died, I was told my mother unraveled, that grief took her mind apart, that she ended up in a public hospital after a fire near the market shelters, that infection set in, that there was nothing to be done, that it would be better for a child not to see what remained. I was raised from then on by my aunt Ireti and our family lawyer, Bode Fashanu, who managed what was left of my father's transport contracts and property claims until I was old enough to inherit. That was the story. That was the ground under my feet for almost 4 decades. And now, a woman under a bridge, with my childhood name on her lips and a key from my father in her hand, had made the ground move. I carried her to my car myself. Not the driver, not security. Me. She weighed almost nothing. That is a detail nobody warns you about when you find someone you loved after a lifetime apart. Your mind is occupied by memory, disbelief, guilt, hope. Then your body tells you something simpler and more brutal. This person has not been cared for. I laid her across the back seat, put my jacket over her legs, and called my private doctor before I called anyone in my family. She drifted in and out on the drive to Ikoyi. Once, while we were stopped in traffic, she grabbed my wrist with startling force and whispered, "Do not let the woman in gold send me away." At the time, I thought fever was speaking. By that night, I knew exactly who she meant. When I reached the house, our anniversary fundraiser had already started. I had forgotten the date only once before in my marriage. Amara had not let me forget it since. She was beautiful in the way luxury can make a person look inevitable. Gold silk, diamond studs, posture so straight it made other people stand up straighter around her. She had built our charitable foundation into something admired, photographed, and invited into rooms that prefer generosity when it comes in polished packaging. I am not going to lie and tell you she was always a villain. Life is not neat enough for that. Amara had been brilliant, disciplined, strategic, and once upon a time kind in ways that did not perform themselves for a crowd. But some people begin by protecting a family and end by protecting only their place inside it. I just had not realized how far along that road she had gone. When she saw the old woman, her first expression was irritation. Then the key appeared. Then the commissioner saw it, and irritation became calculation in one face and fear in another. I took the old woman, my possible mother, my impossible mother, upstairs to the East guest suite. Amara followed me as far as the doorway. "Ayo," she said, keeping her voice low, "you are carrying a stranger through a house full of donors. She is sick." That is not what I said. I laid the woman gently on the bed and turned to face my wife. "What do you think I am carrying, Amara?" She looked at the old woman, then at the key, then at me. "I think," she said carefully, "that grief makes wealthy men careless, and I think careless wealthy men become prey." It was such a smooth sentence. That should have warned me more than it did. Our doctor came and stabilized her. Severe dehydration, untreated pneumonia, malnutrition. Burn scarring on her left shoulder and upper arm, long healed and badly managed. The scars mattered. The story I had been told about my mother had always involved a fire. Before midnight, the old woman was asleep with an IV running and a humidifier on the bedside table. I stood there longer than I needed to. I wanted some immediate certainty, a sudden burst of recognition, some voice from inside saying, "Yes, this is your mother. Stop doubting." What I got instead was memory arriving in fragments. The way she said, "River boy." The exact knot used on the red thread around the key. A faint line near her right eyebrow I suddenly remembered from leaning against her lap as a child while she oiled my scalp. Memory does not always enter like thunder. Sometimes it slips back into a room like someone who once lived there and still remembers where the cups are kept. Amara came to my study at nearly 1 in the morning. She did not shout. My wife almost never shouted. She preferred reason, the way some people prefer weapons with no visible blade. "Ayo, if this woman is truly who she claims to be, then we will do right by her. But if she is not, then tonight has already exposed us to blackmail, scandal, and possible fraud." She knew my childhood name. That could be learned. She had my father's key. That could be stolen. The way she said it, calm, patient, almost gentle, was more persuasive than anger would have been. Because some lies do not try to overpower your judgment. They simply borrow its voice. She suggested a DNA test, a background inquiry, temporary discretion. We control this quietly, for your sake, for Toby's sake, for the company's sake. And this is the part I am not proud of. Part of me agreed. Not because I believed the old woman was lying. Because hope can frighten a man as much as loss when he has lived without it too long. If I accepted her immediately and she turned out not to be my mother, I would have exposed the oldest wound in me to a stranger. So I agreed to the test. I told myself it was prudence. I would later learn that prudence and cowardice can look very similar in an expensive room. The next 3 days changed everything. Slowly. That is how the deepest changes often happen. Not in the dramatic instant people later describe, but in the accumulation of details too specific to fake. She knew where my father used to hide bus receipts when cash inspectors came early. She knew I hated beans as a child unless she mashed ripe plantain into them. She knew the scar behind my knee came from jumping off a wooden canoe before my father had tied it properly. She knew the first song my father wrote after they married, and how he always forgot the second verse when she sang it back to him. None of that lived online. None of that could be bought from a gossiping neighbor. None of that was the kind of fact a con artist builds a performance around. And still, I hesitated. My son did not. Toby was 13, old enough to notice what adults pretend children do not see. He sat with her the second afternoon while I was on a call with Singapore investors. When I came upstairs, I found him on the rug by her bed, chin on folded arms, listening to her tell him about Lagos before the flyovers, when roadside coconut sellers still knew customers by name, and children played football in places that would one day become car parks. That evening, he came into my office holding his phone. I recorded her singing. Singing what? The song Grandpa wrote. I looked up at him. My father had died before Toby was born. My son pressed play. Her voice was thin with age, but sure in the way old roads are sure. And beneath the thinness I heard it, not memory exactly, but recognition. My body knew before my mind was ready to. Toby studied me for a moment. You already know, Dad. You're just scared of knowing before a paper tells you. Children sometimes say a thing so plainly that there is nowhere for your pride to hide. I said nothing. He added, She looks at the house like she's apologizing to it. I had noticed that too. The way she never touched anything without permission. The way she folded her wrapper carefully before sitting, even on upholstered chairs no guest thought twice about using. The way gratitude seemed to exhaust her, as if life had forced her to say thank you for too little, too often. Amara, meanwhile, began adjusting the atmosphere of the house without ever appearing to do so. The staff were told to keep valuables secure. The guest list for the rescheduled donor brunch grew mysteriously larger. And when people asked discreet questions about the old woman staying with us, Amara answered with the same polished sentence. Io is helping someone with a complicated story while we verify the facts. Helping someone. Not sheltering family, not welcoming home, helping someone. Language tells you where power thinks it lives. At the brunch, Amara introduced the old woman to our guests as Mama Sade. A respectful enough title on its face, except it was not her name. Her name, I would later learn, was Sade Akinwale. But titles can be used to honor or to reduce, depending on who is speaking and who is listening. My mother wore one of my late aunt's simple blue wrappers because she had nothing suitable for a house full of people whose shoes cost more than she had likely touched in months. She sat straight-backed and quiet near the terrace doors, while laughter moved around her like she was furniture people did not want to acknowledge. One banker's wife asked loudly whether she had family outside of all this. A developer I knew from Abuja smiled and said, "Remarkable how these stories appear around successful men." A pastor's wife took Amara aside and whispered something sympathetic with her eyes still on the old woman, and I hated that I could not hear the words because I knew the shape of them already. Concern is one of the safest disguises cruelty has ever worn. The old woman, my mother, ate little. She kept her hands folded in her lap. At one point, Toby brought her a second piece of puff-puff, because he noticed she had pushed the first one aside, until everybody else had finished. Like someone trained by scarcity, never to reach first in a rich room. I should have ended that brunch the moment I saw that. I did not. 3 days later, Amara's ruby earring disappeared. It was one of a matching set given to her by her mother. The house was searched. Not violently, not theatrically, just efficiently, politely, with the terrible cleanliness wealth brings to humiliation. The missing earring was found wrapped in tissue inside my mother's market bag. I remember the silence in that room more clearly than the accusations, because silence makes its decision before words do. Amara closed her eyes as though pain, not triumph, had found her. "I was trying to prevent exactly this," she said. My mother looked from the earring to me. "I did not take it." Her voice did not sound panicked. It sounded tired. There is a special kind of devastation that comes from realizing the truth may not survive long enough to matter. I wish I could tell you I stood by her instantly. I did not. I stood there with a lifetime of grief in one hand and a piece of planted evidence in the other, and let doubt humiliate me. By evening, Bode Fashanu was in my study. He had been our family lawyer for 29 years. He was the sort of man whose glasses always sat low on his nose, as if even his posture had learned patience from documents. He recommended a private elder care facility in Lekki until matters became clear. He recommended legal distance. He recommended psychiatric assessment. He recommended protection. Men like Bode never call it removal. They call it process. My mother did not beg when I told her. That remains one of the sharpest pains in this story. She did not plead, because she had lived long enough to understand when power had already made its choice. She only looked at the brass key in her own hand and asked one question. "Does your wife know what this opens?" I said, "I don't know what it opens." She gave me a long, unreadable look. "Then do not lose it." The next morning I signed the papers. I watched attendants in clean uniforms guide my own mother into a polished vehicle bound for a beautiful cage, and I signed the transfer. If you are waiting for me to defend that, I cannot. I have replayed it 100 times. I can explain it. Fear, shame, confusion, pressure. A life spent trusting paper more than instinct. But explanation is not redemption. Toby did not speak to me for almost 2 days after she was taken away. It was not a child's sulk. It was disappointment, quiet enough to make every room in the house feel smaller. The person who finally cracked the story open was not me. It was Bisi, our senior housekeeper. Bisi had worked for us 11 years, long enough to know the rhythm of our arguments by footstep alone. She was a widow from Abeokuta, with a back that hurt in the rainy season and eyes that missed almost nothing. She came to me on the 3rd night after the transfer and asked whether we could speak somewhere without cameras. That sentence alone should tell you how afraid she was. In the pantry, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale, she told me she had seen Amara place the ruby earring inside my mother's market bag the morning before the search. Not hide it carefully, not even hesitantly. Place it there with the calm speed of somebody who had already convinced herself necessity made it acceptable. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. Bisi looked at the floor. "Because rich women can replace a maid faster than truth can replace a salary." Then she looked up and added, "But that old woman thanked me for hot water like I had given her a house." I could not sleep after that. Before I could respond, Toby appeared in the doorway. He had heard enough to know the shape of what was being said, and in his hand was a cream-colored envelope he had found in Amara's writing desk while looking for printer paper. Inside were draft statements about an unstable claimant, unsigned transfer authorizations to the care facility, and a payment ledger showing the facility had been contacted 2 weeks before the earring ever disappeared. 2 weeks before. That meant Amara had begun arranging my mother's removal before the supposed theft provided justification. I sat down hard on the pantry stool. For a long moment, I heard nothing but the refrigerator motor and rain on the back gate. Then something else rose in me. Rage, yes, but beneath that, something worse. Recognition. I had been managed, not just as a husband, as an asset. I asked security to pull footage from the upstairs corridor. The segment covering my mother's room and the guest hall had been erased. Not corrupted, not missing, manually deleted. But our chief technician, an older man who still distrusted cloud systems, remembered an outdated local backup Amara did not know still mirrored portions of the house feed whenever the internet failed in storms. That backup saved everything. We watched the footage just after midnight. Amara entered the guest hall alone, looked once over her shoulder, removed the earring from her own jewelry pouch, placed it in my mother's bag, closed the zipper, walked away. No hesitation, no trembling, no sign of conflict on her face, just purpose. I thought then that this would be the worst thing I learned. It was not. The next morning I drove alone to the care facility. No driver, no assistant, no jacket. Just me and the brass key in my pocket. My mother was sitting near a window, looking out at an ornamental pond so still, it seemed designed to persuade people that peace and captivity were close relatives. When she saw me, she did not rise. She did not smile. She asked, "Have you come to ask questions or to apologize?" That is a hard sentence to hear from the woman who gave you life. "Both," I said. She nodded once, as if that answer had at least passed the minimum test. I showed her the key. Her fingers closed around it with reverence so immediate I felt ashamed for not understanding it sooner. "Your father made this look ordinary," she said. "Because in this country, the safest hiding place for truth is sometimes something everybody thinks is too small to matter." She turned the key over and pressed her nail into a seam near the bow. A sliver of metal shifted. Inside the hollow stem, wrapped in waxed thread, was a rolled scrap of paper. On it was written an address in my father's hand. St. Bartholomew's Wharf Chapel, Storage Room 3. That chapel stood near the old marina, where my father once leased cargo sheds before the port expansions swallowed half the district. It had been closed for years. "What is there?" I asked. "The part of the story nobody wanted you to find," she said. I took Toby and Bisi with me that afternoon. I brought Toby because he had already proven himself steadier than many adults I knew. I brought Bisi because truth deserves witnesses who have earned the right to stand near it. The chapel smelled of salt, dust, and old varnish. The priest who still oversaw the property remembered my father immediately and led us to a locked corridor behind the vestry where unused storage rooms sat forgotten under corrugated roofing. The brass key opened room 3 on the first turn. Inside was a metal trunk. Not large, not glamorous. Just the kind of box a cautious man trusts more than a bank when he has seen banks choose the powerful over the honest one too many times. In that trunk, we found photographs of my mother, taken months after the fire I had been told killed her. We found hospital forms under a false spelling of her surname, We found letters my mother had written to my aunt that had never been delivered. We found my father's notebooks, detailing a cooperative land claim tied to the same waterfront parcel my company was now preparing to redevelop. And beneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth, we found the thing that made Commissioner Belogan go pale in my entrance hall. A ledger of compensation payments meant for market widows and displaced families after the fire near the marina nearly 39 years earlier. Many names had been crossed out, others replaced. Funds rerouted through Shell trustees. And on the authorization pages were signatures from a young legal advisor named Bode Fashanu, and an administrative liaison whose surname matched Commissioner Belogan's. My mother sat down on an overturned crate when she saw the ledger. "He told them I was dead," she said. "Who?" "Your lawyer first. Then the others who benefited from no widow returning with a claim." The room became very quiet. She told me the rest slowly. The fire had not killed her. It had left her burned, sedated, and confused for weeks. During that time, compensation battles erupted over waterfront relocation funds, cooperative transport rights, and a set of land claims my father had been pursuing on behalf of traders and ferry families. My father had died before he could finalize them. When my mother tried to reclaim the documents after recovering, she was told her son had already been placed, the estate settled, the records completed, the process closed. Closed. As if a life could be folded and filed because powerful people had finished needing it. Over the years, she had searched. Government offices, parish records, old company clerks, market women who remembered my father's roots. Everywhere she went, paperwork had vanished just ahead of her, or changed just enough to turn certainty into dispute. Eventually, poverty did what corruption began. It wore her down. The market bag, the bridge, the pneumonia, the exhausted body in my back seat. None of that had started with bad luck. It had started with a decision made in clean offices by people who found her absence convenient. I confronted Bode Fashanu the next day in his chambers. I laid the photographs, hospital forms, and compensation ledger on his desk, one piece at a time. He did not deny it immediately. Men like that rarely do. First, they search for language that makes theft sound administrative. "Ayo, you have to understand the climate at the time." "No," I said, "you have to understand the timing." "I found my mother because she nearly died under a bridge built over land you helped steal from widows." He removed his glasses. "She was unstable after the fire. She was alive. The estate was vulnerable. She was my mother. I made a difficult judgment. You made a profitable one." He tried then to retreat into paternal language. He said I would not have become the man I was if events had unfolded differently, as though my wealth could excuse the fraud that purchased it more neatly. That sentence ended whatever respect remained in me. I left his office and called an emergency meeting that night at the house. Not in a hotel, not in chambers, not quietly. At my house. I wanted the truth to stand where the lie had been most comfortable. Amara came dressed in cream, as if neutral colors could disguise a guilty heart. Commissioner Belogan arrived 10 minutes late and angry to have been summoned. 2 board members from our foundation came. Our security chief, BC, Toby, and my mother, joining first by video from the facility, because I had not yet risked moving her before formal release papers were secured. I placed the brass key in the center of the dining table, then the trunk documents, then the backup footage. I played the clip of Amara planting the earring without introduction. No one spoke for several seconds after it ended. Amara was the first. This proves nothing except that I was trying to protect my family from a threat you refused to assess properly. A threat? I asked. She lifted her chin. A woman appears with a sentimental object tied to a land parcel under active review. She gains access to our home. She destabilizes your judgment. Yes, Ao, a threat. There it was. Not grief, not fear. Interest. The land. My mother's return threatened more than Amara's comfort. It threatened a redevelopment deal. The old loading ramp property, the marina annex, the mixed-use luxury project we were packaging for foreign investors. It sat on title history linked to the same compensation fraud. If my mother's claim gained legal force, the entire chain could unravel. Amara had not simply wanted my mother gone because she was poor. She wanted her gone because she was evidence. Commissioner Balogun stood abruptly. This is spiraling into accusation. No, I said. It is narrowing into accountability. I handed copies of the compensation ledger to the board members. One of them, a retired judge, read the names twice before looking up. These payments were public funds. They were diverted, I said. Balogun's jaw hardened. Be careful. Careful is how this lasted 40 years. My mother's voice came through the speaker before anyone else could interrupt. I stood outside 3 ministries asking for my son by name, she said. Each time they told me there was no record. But there was always record enough for somebody to eat. No one in that room could look away from the screen. There are voices age makes more powerful, not less. Amara turned to me with a last attempt at private appeal disguised as reason. Ayo, think what this does to the company. And that sentence, of all sentences, freed me. Because in that moment, I finally understood the order of things in her heart. Not mother first, not truth first, not even me first. Company first, because the company was where status lived. I said, I am thinking about what I did to my mother when I let the company speak louder than blood. Toby, from the far end of the table, spoke softly. I was less ashamed that Grandma was poor than I was that rich people were scared of her. It is hard to describe the effect of a child telling the truth in a room built on adult performance. It was like a window opening in a house where everybody had adjusted to stale air. Balogun left first. The board members stayed. Amara did not cry. She did not confess. She did not collapse. She simply looked around the room and realized the machinery that had always responded to her voice no longer did. Power does not always end with drama. Sometimes it ends with people failing to move when you expect them to. The DNA results came the next morning. A positive maternal match. By then, strangely, it almost felt unnecessary. Useful in court, useful in records, useful against men who worship stamps and seals. But my heart had already accepted what my pride took too long to admit. I had found my mother. Then I had doubted her. Then I had let my doubt be weaponized against her. That was the truth I had to live with, no matter what justice followed. I secured her release from the facility and drove to bring her home myself. No convoy, no staff, no announcement. When she saw me standing at reception with discharge papers in one hand and the brass key in the other, she asked, "Have you come as a son this time?" "Yes," I said. That one word nearly broke me more than all the shouting I never did. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. On the drive back, she did not ask whether Amara would be there. She did not ask whether the staff had been informed. She did not ask whether she belonged. She had lived too long without belonging safely to believe in it quickly. So I told her before we reached the gate. This house will not test you again. She looked out the window for a long moment and said, "Then perhaps this is the first house I have entered in years." Amara was gone by the end of that week. Not publicly disgraced in the melodramatic way people imagine. No glasses thrown, no police escort down the steps. Just a lawyered separation, a resigned foundation chairmanship, access revoked, and a long black SUV leaving through the front gate one morning without anyone from the house staff coming out to wave goodbye. I filed for divorce quietly. There are some wars you do not continue once the truth no longer needs the spectacle. Bode Fashanu lost his license pending criminal inquiry. The compensation fraud triggered broader investigations into land transfers along the waterfront. Commissioner Balagun was not arrested immediately. That is not how power usually works. But the protections around him thinned. Sometimes accountability does not arrive as a hammer. Sometimes it arrives as sunlight, and certain creatures simply do not survive being seen too clearly for too long. The harder work began after that. Justice in public is often simpler than repair in private. My mother came home with one market bag, 2 wrappers, an inhaler, the brass key, and more caution than belongings. At first, she woke before dawn and stood in the kitchen as if waiting for permission to boil water. She folded every blanket each morning like a guest expecting checkout. She thanked BC for every meal, no matter how small. She apologized whenever Toby sat beside her too long, as if affection cost rent. Trauma does not leave when the gates open. It lingers in the hands, in the shoulders, in the reflex to make yourself smaller. So we moved slowly. I turned the upstairs study with the morning light into a sewing room for her, after she mentioned, almost casually, that she used to mend school uniforms at the market before the fire. Toby brought her old High Life playlists and pretended he wanted history lessons, when really he wanted stories. BC, who had risked her job to tell the truth, became my mother's fiercest defender in the house. The first time my mother laughed fully, head back, eyes wet, one hand on Toby's shoulder because she could not sit upright through it. I stepped into the hall and leaned against the wall, because I was not prepared for how much grief can hide inside joy returning. We did more than repair the house. We changed the business. The old luxury marina project was halted and restructured. Not because public pressure forced me first, because conscience finally did. Part of the site became market-rate housing, yes. Investors are still investors, and reality remains reality. But another large section was reassigned to a legal aid and temporary housing center for displaced elderly women, informal traders, and families lost in compensation disputes. We named it the River Key Center. Not after me. After the object my father trusted to outlive corruption. I made sure every founding document carried my mother's full name, Sade Akinwale, not as beneficiary only, but as co-chair of the advisory trust. A woman once erased from paperwork, now signing the papers that would protect others from the same fate. That mattered to me more than any ribbon-cutting photo ever could. Months later, at the opening ceremony, cameras lined the courtyard, reporters adjusted microphones, and local officials gave speeches full of the kind of regret people discover only after consequences become visible. Commissioner Balogan did not attend. He sent a statement. My mother laughed when she heard that and said, "Paper again." Then she signed our registration board with a steady hand. Afterward, we visited the old wharf chapel. Toby had asked if the brass key should be kept in a vault. My mother said no. Some things are safer in sight once enough truth surrounds them. So we had the key sealed inside a glass frame in the center lobby of the River Key Center. Not as decoration, as warning, as memory, as proof that a thing can be small and still unlock a whole buried history. My mother eventually told me the part of the story I had been most afraid to hear. Why she stopped searching openly. Not because she stopped loving me. Not because she believed the lies. Because poverty punishes persistence when the persistent are powerless. Every office required transport fare. Every file search required another signature. Every signature required waiting. Waiting required food. Food required money. Money required work. Burn scars, age, and missing papers kept work from lasting. By the time she found one clue, hunger had already eaten the time needed to pursue the next. That explanation humbled me more than scandal ever did, because men like me love to think every loss can be defeated with enough determination. We rarely admit how expensive determination becomes when the system charges the poor for every attempt at dignity. One evening, almost a year after I found her, I asked whether she hated me for sending her away that week. She was hemming a school blouse in the sewing room, her glasses low on her nose, evening light on her hands. She did not answer immediately. Finally, she said, "I hated the fear in you more than I hated you, because fear in a good man can do a cruel man's work." I sat with that for a long time. Then she added, softer, "But you came back before pride made a home of it." That was as close to forgiveness as I deserved, and maybe closer than I had any right to expect. Toby changed too. He began volunteering at the center on Saturdays, mostly carrying boxes, fixing fans, reading forms aloud for elders whose eyesight had dimmed. One day, he asked why so many women apologized before asking for help. My mother answered before I could. "Because this world teaches the poor to arrive sorry." That line has stayed with me. Sometimes I hear it when I sit in negotiations now, especially when men in expensive watches speak of relocation zones and vulnerable populations as if they were weather patterns instead of people. The divorce with Amara finalized quietly. We saw each other once after that, at a memorial fundraiser neither of us expected the other to attend. She looked composed, but there is a difference between elegance and certainty, and the second thing was missing. We spoke for less than 3 minutes. She said, "I did what I thought was necessary." And there was a time I might have argued. There was a time I might have tried to force remorse out of someone who had built a life avoiding it. Instead, I said, "Necessary for whom?" She did not answer, because some questions do not need responses once the silence has already confessed enough. Bode sent one written apology through counsel. It was careful, sanitized, full of words like unfortunate and misjudgment and historical complexity. I did not reply. There are harms paper cannot settle, especially when paper helped create them. If this story has a lesson, it is not simply that evil rich people sometimes lie and poor old women sometimes tell the truth. That is too easy. The harder lesson is this: a man can love justice in public and still fail it in private when the truth arrives looking inconvenient. A family can speak the language of compassion and still deny dignity to the person who needs it most. And wealth, if you do not watch it carefully, can convince you that caution is wisdom, even when caution is only fear dressed in better fabric. I think often about the moment under the bridge when my mother said, "River boy," and held up that little brass key. I ask myself, what might have happened if I had listened fully in the first hour? If I had trusted the memory in my bones before waiting for laboratories and legal opinions? If I had chosen tenderness faster? But regret is only useful if it teaches. So I let it teach. It slows my hand before signatures now. It sharpens my ear when powerless people speak. It reminds me that truth does not always arrive clean, documented, and well-dressed. Sometimes, truth arrives coughing under a bridge with one shoe missing. And if you are blessed enough to recognize it, the question is not whether the truth looks respectable. The question is whether your heart still knows how to open the door. Not long ago, an elderly woman came into the River Key Center clutching a laminated photograph of two boys and a bread seller's receipt from 1989. She had spent 17 years trying to locate a nephew whose records had been altered after a hospital transfer. The staff were busy. The waiting area was full. There were forms to process, intake categories to assign, procedures to follow. I felt procedure rising in me like an old reflex. Then I heard my mother from across the room. "Sit her down first," she said. "Paper can wait 5 minutes. Shame should not." So we sat her down first. Tea before forms. Water before questions. Dignity before process. And in that small choice, I think we honored everything this story took to learn. If someone you loved came back into your life, older, poorer, wounded, and harder to recognize, would you welcome them first and investigate later? Or would you ask them to prove they belonged before you offered them a chair? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe no mother should ever have to fight paperwork to be recognized by her own child, type key so I know you stayed with me to the end.